He had chosen the corner table for a reason. Table 7 sat just far enough from the door to see everyone who came in, but close enough to the wall that no one could come up behind him unnoticed. It was a quiet diner, one of those places that survived by not asking questions. Harlem had many like it in the early 1950s. Steam from chipped white coffee cups hung in the air. Bacon grease popped behind the counter. Outside, Lenox Avenue breathed slow and steady, like a fighter between rounds. The man sitting at table 7 had been running for 11 years. He'd changed his name twice. He'd crossed state lines more times than he could remember. He'd shaved his beard, grown it back, then shaved it again when he thought someone recognized him. Every morning, he checked the mirror the same way, slow, careful, half expecting the reflection to finally accuse him. But this morning felt different. He didn't know why. He just knew. The bell above the diner door rang once, then again. Boots on tile. Not rushed, not loud, controlled. The man at table 7 felt it before he saw it. The sudden drop in noise, the way conversations faltered, the way the waitress froze with a pot of coffee halfway poured. Harlem knew that silence. Harlem had learned it the hard way. Bumpy Johnson had entered the room. He didn't look angry. That was the part that scared men the most. His coat was pressed. His hat sat low but respectful, not hiding his eyes, never hiding. His walk was unhurried, each step deliberate, as if the floor itself had agreed to move aside for him. The legend stopped 3 tables away. He didn't sit. He didn't smile. He spoke softly. 11 years is a long time to stay lost. The man at table 7 felt his chest tighten. His fork slipped from his fingers and clattered against the plate, loud as a gunshot in the silence. He didn't turn around. He didn't have to. There were only so many men in the world who could speak that calmly and still sound like a sentence had already been passed. Bumpy Johnson had found him. Long before betrayals and disappearances, before the hiding and the fear, Harlem belonged to a different rhythm. In the 1930s and 40s, Harlem was more than streets and buildings. It was an idea, a promise, a battleground wrapped in music and ambition. Jazz spilled from basements. Numbers runners passed folded slips like sacred texts. Politicians shook hands with men they publicly denied knowing. Power wasn't worn. It was understood. And at the center of that understanding stood Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. He wasn't the loudest man in the room. He didn't need to be. His reputation arrived before he did, carried in whispers and lowered voices. Bumpy was a man who read poetry and quoted philosophy, then walked into meetings with mob bosses who underestimated him, and left with better terms than they'd planned to offer. He ruled Harlem not by chaos, but by structure. Respect was the currency. Loyalty was the contract. Betrayal was the only unforgivable crime. Bumpy built his power carefully, brick by brick, favor by favor. He protected numbers runners from police extortion. He kept violence measured, purposeful, never reckless. Harlem prospered under his watch, even as white-controlled syndicates circled from downtown, eager to carve up what they believed couldn't defend itself. They were wrong. But even legends require trust, and trust, once broken, leaves scars deeper than bullets. The man at table 7 had once sat at Bumpy's side. He had eaten his food, shared his information, taken his money. He had been inside rooms other men only dreamed of entering. He knew roots, names, weaknesses. He knew how Harlem breathed. And then, when the pressure came, when law enforcement tightened its grip and rival syndicates raised their offers, he chose survival over loyalty. The betrayal wasn't loud. It never is. A name passed quietly to the wrong ear. A schedule mentioned one too many times. A shipment delayed just long enough for police to intercept it. Nothing that screamed guilt. Just enough to damage trust. Just enough to put lives at risk. Bumpy noticed. He always noticed. At first he waited. Betrayal sometimes corrected itself. Fear sometimes brings men back to their senses. But when confirmation came, when patterns aligned and consequences stacked too neatly, Bumpy didn't rage. He made a decision. The betrayer vanished before the question could be asked. No body, no public reckoning, just absence. For most men, that would have been the end of it. Harlem moved fast. New faces filled old chairs. But Bumpy Johnson didn't forget. He catalogued. He remembered. Time, he once told a confidant, is not protection. It's just distance. The man who ran believed otherwise. For 11 years he told himself the legend had bigger concerns, bigger enemies, bigger wars. He convinced himself that the silence meant forgiveness, or at least indifference. He built a smaller life under a borrowed name, a quiet life. But legends don't confuse silence with surrender. They wait. And now, in a diner that smelled of coffee and inevitability, the distance had finally closed. Bumpy stepped closer to table 7, close enough now that the man could feel his presence like heat at his back. "Turn around," Bumpy said, not a command, a courtesy. The chair scraped slowly as the man obeyed. Their eyes met for the first time in 11 years. And in that moment, the man understood something too late. This wasn't about revenge. This was about accounting. The man's face had aged in ways time alone couldn't explain. 11 years of borrowed air had carved lines deeper than any honest labor ever could. His eyes darted instinctively, door, window, counter, mapping exits that no longer mattered. Bumpy noticed all of it. He always did. Fear spoke a language clearer than words. Bumpy pulled out the chair across from him and sat down slowly. Only then did the room begin to breathe again. The waitress resumed pouring coffee, though her hand trembled. A couple in the corner pretended not to listen. Every ear in the diner was tuned to table 7, even if every face pretended otherwise. Harlem knew when history was unfolding quietly. Bumpy removed his gloves and placed them neatly on the table. "You look thinner," he said, almost politely. "Running does that to a man." The betrayer swallowed. "I didn't think you'd still think," Bumpy interrupted gently. "That was your mistake the first time, too." There was no shouting, no threats. That restraint carried more weight than any raised voice. Bumpy wasn't here to perform. He was here to settle something unfinished. Before the man could answer, Bumpy's mind drifted, not to nostalgia, but to context. Because nothing in Harlem happened in isolation. When the betrayal first occurred, Harlem was under siege from every direction. Federal agents pushed RICO-style investigations before the term even existed. Local police precincts ran their own hustles, squeezing numbers runners for protection money while claiming to clean up the streets. Downtown syndicates saw Harlem as unorganized, a lie they told themselves to justify intrusion. Bumpy stood in the middle of all of it. He negotiated with Italian bosses who refused to say his name out loud. He met with politicians who smiled in public and shook in private. He carried himself with the dignity of a man who knew he represented more than himself. So when information began leaking, precise information, it wasn't paranoia that alerted him. It was mathematics. Too many coincidences. Too many near misses that cut just close enough to send a message. Someone inside the house was whispering to the outside. Bumpy narrowed it down the way he did everything else. Patiently. He changed routes. He altered schedules. He fed false details selectively. One by one, he watched which lies came back wearing police badges. That was when the pattern exposed itself. The man now sitting across from him had once been trusted with numbers routes in Upper Harlem. Not the most powerful position, but one that required discretion. One that touched lives. One that couldn't afford leaks. And when the pressure came, when detectives hinted at leniency, when rivals dangled money, the man folded. Not dramatically. Quietly. He justified it the way cowards always do. Just this once. Just enough to ease the heat. Nobody gets hurt. Except people did. A runner beaten during a raid. A stash seized that fed families. A message sent to Harlem that its defenses were porous. That was the unforgivable part. Now, years later, the man sat exposed, realizing the truth he'd been running from. Bumpy Johnson wasn't a man you escaped. He was a chapter you postponed. You know why I'm here, Bumpy said finally. The man nodded, barely. I never meant for it to go that far, he whispered. They promised. They always promise, Bumpy replied, and they never pay the price. Men like you do. The words landed clean, without cruelty. Bumpy wasn't interested in humiliation. He was interested in clarity. Around them, Harlem listened.
What would he do? That was the unspoken question vibrating in the room. Harlem had seen Bumpy show mercy before. He'd spared men who corrected their mistakes. He'd protected enemies' families when lines were crossed too carelessly. But betrayal, real betrayal, sat in a different category. Still, Bumpy didn't reach into his coat. He didn't nod to any muscle. He didn't escalate. Instead, he leaned back slightly, studying the man as if weighing him, not against anger, but against consequence. Tell me, Bumpy said, what you thought would happen. The man hesitated, then laughed softly, a broken sound. I thought time would cover it. I thought you'd be dead, or locked up. I thought Harlem would move on. Bumpy nodded slowly. Harlem moves on, he agreed, but it doesn't forget who tried to weaken it. That was the heart of it. This wasn't personal vengeance. This was structural. Harlem ran on trust the way other neighborhoods ran on contracts. Break that trust, and the whole thing collapsed. Bumpy leaned forward again. For 11 years, he continued, I let you breathe. That wasn't mercy. That was opportunity. The man looked up sharply. Opportunity for what? For you to decide who you were, Bumpy said. You could have come back. You could have confessed. You could have faced what you did like a man. Silence. You chose hiding, Bumpy finished. The man's shoulders slumped. In that moment, whatever fight he'd preserved across a decade finally drained away. He saw now what had always been true. This meeting wasn't about punishment. It was about resolution. Bumpy stood. The chair legs scraped the floor, sharp in the quiet. Heads turned, hearts tightened. Finish your meal, Bumpy said calmly. We'll talk outside. The man knew what that meant, not in specifics, but in finality. There were conversations you had inside and conversations you had on the street. He nodded. Bumpy placed his gloves back on his hands and turned toward the door. Before leaving, he paused just long enough to let the room absorb the moment. Harlem, he said quietly, without looking back, is patient. Then he walked out into the daylight. The air outside the diner felt heavier than it had moments before. Lenox Avenue stretched out under a pale afternoon sky, busy enough to look ordinary, quiet enough to feel staged. Bumpy stood near the curb, hands folded behind his back, eyes forward. He wasn't watching the door. He didn't need to. The man inside would come out. Fear had already agreed to that. Across the street, a shoeshine man slowed his brush. A newspaper vendor stopped calling out headlines. Harlem had learned to read stillness the way sailors read weather. Nothing happened by accident when Bumpy Johnson was involved. Inside the diner, the betrayer stared down at his untouched plate. His appetite was gone, replaced by a tight pressure in his throat. He could run. He thought about it. He could bolt for the back door, scatter into the crowd, disappear again. But he knew better now. Running had already been tried. It had only delayed the inevitable. He paid the bill with shaking hands and stood. The bell above the door rang as he stepped outside, the sound cutting sharper than it had when Bumpy entered. Bumpy didn't turn around. Walk with me, he said. They moved down the sidewalk together, side by side, but worlds apart. No escorts. No visible protection. That was intentional. Bumpy understood symbolism as well as any politician. A legend didn't need an army to prove authority. You ever notice, Bumpy said casually, how men think distance changes what they owe? The man kept his eyes on the pavement. I never stopped owing, he said. I just didn't know how to pay." "That's another lie," Bumpy replied. "You knew. You just didn't like the cost." They passed a barber shop, its window fogged with steam and conversation. Inside, men paused mid-sentence as the pair went by. Recognition spread quietly. Bumpy acknowledged no one, but everyone acknowledged him. Respect moved faster than rumors. "Do you know what your information cost me?" Bumpy asked. The man shook his head. "It cost families income. It cost runners safety. It cost Harlem leverage." Bumpy stopped walking and finally turned to face him. "But worst of all, it told people we couldn't protect our own house." That was the real wound. In Harlem, perception was armor. Once cracked, outsiders pressed harder. Police got bolder. Rivals got reckless. One act of betrayal rippled outward in ways most men never bothered to consider. The man's voice cracked. "I was scared." Bumpy nodded once. "So was everyone who depended on you." They stood near a narrow side street, one that didn't see much traffic. No shadows thick enough to hide in. No audience large enough to perform for. This was intentional, too. Justice didn't need witnesses, only understanding. Bumpy gestured toward the street. "Talk," he said. "Everything." And so the man did. He spoke about detectives leaning in too close, about promises whispered in stairwells, about the slow panic that came with realizing he was a small piece in a very large machine. He spoke about justifying each step until the steps became a path he couldn't leave. Bumpy listened without interruption. That, more than anything, unnerved the man. Rage would have been easier. Violence would have made sense. But listening required confidence, the kind only a man certain of his position could afford. When the man finished, Bumpy was silent for a long moment. "You know," he said finally, "there were men who faced worse pressure than you. Men with more to lose. They didn't fold." "I wasn't them," the man whispered. "No," Bumpy agreed. "You weren't." The words weren't cruel. They were factual. The challenge had never been whether the man would be punished. The real question was how justice would be shaped. Harlem watched not for blood, but for balance. Bumpy reached into his coat, not suddenly, not threateningly, and pulled out a folded envelope. He handed it to the man. Inside were names, locations, dates. "The people you talked to," Bumpy said. "The ones who used you." The man stared at the paper, confused. "You already know all this." "Yes," Bumpy said, "but now you're going to say it out loud." The man looked up sharply. "To who?" "To the community," Bumpy replied. "To the people who were hurt. To the ones who deserve truth more than I deserve satisfaction." The weight of it hit harder than any sentence could have. Public accountability. In Harlem, reputation was life. Being known as a thief or a killer was one thing. Being known as a betrayer, one who weakened his own people, that was a permanent mark. "You'll stand in front of them," Bumpy continued, "and you'll tell them what you did and why. No excuses, no justifications." "And then?" the man asked. Bumpy held his gaze. "Then your debt begins to close." It wasn't mercy. It wasn't cruelty. It was consequence. The man exhaled slowly, realizing something profound. He would live. But the life he'd built on hiding would end. "I'll do it," he said. The truth stacked up, undeniable. Each word tightened the noose of reputation he would wear from that day forward. When he finished, the room was silent again, but different now. This silence carried clarity. Bumpy stepped forward once more. "This," he said, gesturing gently toward the man, "is what betrayal looks like when it's stripped of excuses." He turned to the room. "Every one of us faces fear. Every one of us is tested. What matters is who pays the price when we fail." He let his gaze move across the crowd. Harlem paid, The words settled heavy but fair. Bumpy then turned back to the man. "You've spoken the truth. That matters." The man looked up, eyes wet but steady. "But truth alone doesn't repair damage," Bumpy continued. "Action does." He addressed the room again. "This man will spend the rest of his days making restitution. He will work where he's needed. He will contribute where he once took. He will not hide, and he will not be trusted with power again." A pause. "But he will live." That final line landed with weight. Some had expected blood, others had feared it. What they received instead was balance, justice without spectacle. The man exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding for 11 years. Bumpy's voice lowered. "If anyone here believes that isn't enough, you're free to say so." No one spoke, not because they were afraid, but because they understood. Harlem didn't need another grave. It needed its standards reaffirmed. Bumpy stepped back, signaling the end of it. The crowd slowly dispersed, conversations quiet and thoughtful. The moment would be discussed for years but never exaggerated. It didn't need embellishment. Outside, the sky had darkened to deep blue. Streetlights flickered on one by one. The man approached Bumpy hesitantly. "Thank you," he said, knowing how small the word sounded. Bumpy looked at him. "Don't thank me," he replied. "Earn the space you were given." They parted without ceremony. In the days that followed, the shift was subtle but unmistakable. Police pressure eased, not out of fear, but uncertainty. Rivals recalculated. Harlem's internal lines hardened, clearer than before. Everyone understood now. Betrayal would be exposed, not exploited. Power would be exercised, not abused. Bumpy Johnson's legend grew, not because he destroyed a man, but because he demonstrated something rarer: control. He showed that authority didn't need chaos to sustain itself. That respect, once reaffirmed, could travel farther than intimidation ever could. And somewhere in Harlem, a man began a long, visible penance. No longer hiding, no longer running. The ledger had been reopened, and for the first time in 11 years, it was finally being balanced. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They never did in Harlem. They moved the way real change always moved, quietly, deliberately, and in full view of those who mattered. The man who had once disappeared was seen again, day after day, working jobs no one romanticized. He hauled crates for grocers who didn't greet him warmly. He ran errands for elders who watched him closely, measuring consistency more than effort. He stood in long lines without complaint and accepted short answers without protest. No one threatened him. No one had to. His presence alone was the reminder. People spoke around him, not to him. Children were warned not to repeat his name. Adults referenced him indirectly. That's what happens when, without ever finishing the sentence. Harlem had a way of enforcing judgment that didn't require force. And Bumpy Johnson let it happen that way. He didn't assign overseers. He didn't send reminders. The community understood the terms, and the man understood his place within them. That balance was intentional. Meanwhile, the ripple effects of the public reckoning traveled outward. Law enforcement shifted tactics. Detectives who once relied on quiet informants found doors closed and faces turned away, not aggressively, politely. Harlem had seen what happened to those who spoke out of turn, and more importantly, what happened to those who tried to profit from betrayal. Downtown syndicates noticed too. They had long believed Harlem's strength came from fear, one man holding the reins. What they saw now unsettled them more. The structure held without spectacle. Loyalty didn't crack under pressure. And when it did, the response wasn't impulsive. It was surgical. That kind of order was difficult to disrupt. Bumpy watched it all from a distance. He returned to his routines. Meetings in back rooms thick with smoke and unspoken rules, long walks through familiar streets, quiet evenings with books most men never expected him to read. He didn't boast about what had happened. He didn't revisit it. A man confident in his authority didn't need to relive it. Still, people came to him, carefully. A runner asked what would happen if someone else confessed to smaller betrayals. A shop owner asked whether mistakes could be forgiven before they became crimes. Bumpy answered each question the same way. Before damage is done, there's always a way back. After damage, there was only accounting. The man at the center of it all understood that distinction better than anyone. Weeks turned into months. His shoulders straightened, not from pride, but acceptance. He learned the rhythm of honest work again. He learned that time moved differently when it wasn't spent looking over one's shoulder. One afternoon, as he stacked boxes behind a market, Bumpy passed by. They didn't stop. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. That silence carried closure. For Harlem, the event became a reference point, not a legend of violence, but of restraint. Parents told their children about loyalty without naming names. Older men used it as proof that leadership didn't have to be loud to be effective. And for Bumpy Johnson, it marked something subtle but profound. He had always been known as a man who could respond decisively. Now he was known as a man who could choose how. That distinction mattered. Years later, when pressures mounted again, new players, new laws, new threats, Harlem remembered that lesson. It didn't splinter. It didn't panic. It adjusted. Because justice had been demonstrated, not merely promised. The man who once betrayed the house lived out his days without comfort, but without fear. He wasn't redeemed. Redemption wasn't offered, but he was accounted for. And in Harlem, that was the difference between chaos and continuity. Bumpy Johnson's name carried further weight because of it, not as a symbol of intimidation, but as a standard. Men understood that power came with responsibility, and responsibility came with memory. Nothing was forgotten. Nothing was rushed. Everything was measured. That was the kind of justice Harlem trusted. Time has a way of sharpening certain moments. What happened in that community hall didn't grow larger in the retelling. It grew clearer. As Harlem changed, as new generations took the streets and new pressures reshaped the neighborhood, the story endured not because it was dramatic, but because it was instructive. Men spoke about it in barbershops years later, not lowering their voices in fear, but in respect. That's when he showed who he really was, someone would say. They didn't need to explain who he was. Bumpy Johnson's authority had always been understood, but after that day, it became defined. He was no longer just the man who negotiated with syndicates or held ground against police overreach. He became the man who demonstrated that leadership meant holding everyone to the same standard, including those who once stood close. That was rare. In a world where power was often proved through excess, Bumpy proved it through control. The long-term impact showed itself in subtle shifts. Informants grew scarce, not because people feared retribution, but because they believed in belonging. Harlem's internal disputes were handled with more transparency. Men thought twice before testing lines that had been clearly drawn. The lesson was simple and unforgiving. Loyalty wasn't demanded, it was expected. Bumpy never codified that lesson in writing. He didn't need to. Harlem carried it forward organically, passed down like street law without ink. Even those who opposed him understood it. Downtown bosses adjusted how they approached Harlem, recognizing that destabilization wouldn't come from inside anymore. Police departments rotated personnel more frequently. Aware that long-term leverage was unreliable, the neighborhood had closed ranks, not in defiance, but in clarity. Bumpy Johnson's legend, by then, was no longer confined to Harlem. Writers, lawmen, and rivals alike spoke about him as a paradox, a man of measured words and decisive outcomes, someone who read poetry and enforced order with equal seriousness, and when they spoke about his power, they spoke less about what he took and more about what he preserved. Dignity. That was the true currency of the event. The man who had betrayed the house faded into obscurity as intended. not erased, but diminished. His life became a quiet footnote, a reminder rather than a warning. Bumpy never referenced him again. That silence mattered. It told Harlem that justice wasn't about dominance, it was about completion. Once a matter was resolved, it stayed resolved. There was no need to reopen wounds for the sake of reputation. As Bumpy aged, younger men sought his counsel. They expected stories of battles and standoffs. What they received instead were lessons about patience, leverage, and consequence. "Anybody can react," he once told a young associate. "Only a few can decide how." That philosophy traced directly back to the moment when he could have chosen spectacle and chose structure instead. When history later tried to simplify Bumpy Johnson into a caricature, criminal, kingpin, outlaw, those who had lived under his watch knew better. They remembered the day a man returned from 11 years of hiding, not to be destroyed, but to be made accountable. They remembered how the streets stayed calm. They remembered how power shifted without violence. They remembered how respect was restored. That memory outlived any rumor. It became part of Harlem's moral architecture, a reference point for what leadership looked like when it wasn't performative. Bumpy Johnson didn't just enforce rules, he taught Harlem how to enforce them on itself. And that was why his name endured. Not shouted, but spoken with weight. This story was never about a man who ran. It was about a man who waited. In a world obsessed with immediate retaliation, Bumpy Johnson understood something deeper. That real power didn't rush. It remembered. It observed. And when the moment arrived, it acted with precision instead of impulse. The betrayal that shook Harlem didn't end in blood or spectacle. It ended in truth, in accountability, in a community watching one of its own face the weight of his choices, not through destruction, but through exposure. That was the lesson. Bumpy Johnson didn't chase the man who disappeared. He let time do what time always does, strip away illusions. When the reckoning came, it wasn't fueled by anger, but by responsibility. Responsibility to the people who trusted him. Responsibility to the order that kept Harlem standing when every outside force expected it to fall apart. This wasn't about vengeance. This was about dignity. Harlem learned that day that leadership wasn't proven by how hard you struck, but by how carefully you chose when and why. That justice didn't need chaos to be felt. And that respect, once earned the right way, traveled farther than fear ever could. The man who betrayed the house lived on, carrying his sentence every day in the open. The man who ruled Harlem walked on, his legend deepened not by destruction, but by restraint. And that is why Bumpy Johnson's name still carries weight. Not because he ruled with violence, but because when faced with betrayal, he chose to protect the soul of his community. Sometimes, the most legendary response isn't the loudest one, it's the one that restores balance and reminds the world what respect truly means.